January 18, 1992. NAS Dallas, Texas. The sun hangs low over the tarmac as a lone F-4 Phantom rolls to a stop for the final time. Its twin General Electric J79 engines spool down, the characteristic whine fading into silence. 30 years of Marine Corps service ends not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a throttle moving to cutoff. The Cowboys of VMF, A112, have just completed the last Phantom flight in United States naval aviation history. For 3 decades, this big, ugly, magnificent machine carried Marine aviators into harm's way. From the rice paddies of Vietnam to the frozen reaches of Iceland, from the deck of aircraft carriers to the austere airstrips of Thailand, the Phantom did everything the Corps asked of it, and more. Other branches moved on. The Navy retired their Phantoms in the mid-1980s. The Air Force followed soon after. But the Marines, as they always do, held the line with what they had. And what they had was the most versatile fighter bomber ever built. This is the story of why the Marines flew the F-4 Phantom longer than anyone else, and what that stubborn devotion says about the Corps itself. The aircraft that would become the Phantom began life as something entirely different. In 1952, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in St. Louis was looking for its next big contract. The company had established itself as a capable builder of naval aircraft, but the defense industry was crowded, and competition was fierce. Their preliminary design manager, David S. Lewis Jr., studied the market carefully and concluded that the Navy represented the greatest opportunity for a major new program. He tasked engineer Herman D. Barkey with refining the company's F-3H Demon into a supersonic successor. Barkey assembled a team of talented engineers and began exploring twin-engine configurations. They built a full-scale mock-up with an unusual feature, one side sized for the Wright J65 engine and the other for the new General Electric J79. This allowed the Navy to evaluate both power plant options without committing to either. The J79 would eventually prove superior, offering better thrust-to-weight ratio and more development potential. On September 19, 1953, McDonnell submitted an unsolicited proposal to the Navy. The response came just over a year later. On October 18, 1954, the Navy issued a letter of intent worth $38 million for 2 prototypes. The aircraft was designated AH-1, an all-weather fighter bomber with 11 external hardpoints and 4 20mm cannons. It was exactly what McDonnell had pitched. The company celebrated what seemed like a straightforward contract win. Then came the meeting that changed everything. On May 26, 1955, 4 Navy officers arrived at McDonnell's offices in St. Louis. What should have been a routine progress review became something far more consequential. Within a single hour, the officers redirected the entire program. The Navy, they explained, already had the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk for ground attack and the Vought F-8 Crusader for dogfighting. What they needed was an all-weather fleet defense interceptor, an aircraft specifically designed to protect carrier battle groups from Soviet bomber attacks. The requirements were precise. The aircraft had to launch from a carrier, cruise 250 nautical miles to meet an incoming threat, patrol the area while searching for targets, intercept and destroy enemy bombers, and return to the carrier. All of this had to happen within a 3-hour deck cycle. The Navy wanted a dedicated interceptor, not a jack of all trades. The cannons were stripped from the design. The 11 hardpoints were removed. 4 semi-recessed AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles replaced them. A second crewman, a radar intercept officer, was added to manage the powerful radar that would be the heart of the weapons system. The aircraft was redesignated F-4H-1. In just 60 minutes, the entire concept had transformed from a conventional fighter bomber into something revolutionary. The decision to omit an internal gun reflected 1950s doctrine that missiles had rendered cannons obsolete. Military planners believed that future air combat would be fought at high speed and long range, with radar-guided missiles destroying targets before pilots ever saw them with their own eyes. Dogfighting was considered a relic of World War II and Korea. Vietnam would prove this assumption catastrophically wrong. But in the late 1950s, the design seemed visionary. Wind tunnel testing at supersonic speeds revealed a need for greater lateral stability. The aircraft exhibited unacceptable handling characteristics at certain angles of attack. Rather than redesigning the expensive titanium central wing section, which would have added months of delay and millions of dollars in cost, engineers devised an elegant solution. They angled only the outer wing portions upward by 12 degrees, creating the Phantom's signature cranked wing silhouette. This dihedral on the outer wings compensated for the stability issues without requiring a complete redesign. The all-moving tailplane received 23 degrees of anhedral to counterbalance the wing changes. The aircraft emerging from the St. Louis factory was ugly by any conventional standard, but it was also powerful and unlike anything that had come before. Robert C. Little, McDonnell's chief test pilot, climbed into the cockpit of the first YF-4H1 on May 27, 1958. The aircraft was still painted in bare metal with minimal markings, looking more like a prototype than a production fighter. Little had extensive experience with high-performance aircraft and knew what to expect from the twin J-79 engines. He advanced the throttles and felt the characteristic rumble as the engines spooled up. The maiden flight lasted just 22 minutes. A hydraulic problem prevented landing gear retraction, limiting speed to 370 knots. Little brought the aircraft back safely and declared the flight a success despite the malfunction. Subsequent flights went smoothly, and the test program accelerated. Later that year, in a competitive fly-off against the Vought XF-8U-3 Crusader III, the Phantom won decisively. The victory came not from raw speed, both aircraft were remarkably fast, but from the two-seat configuration that allowed the back-seater to manage the complex radar while the pilot flew the aircraft. The Navy recognized that dividing the workload between two crew members made the Phantom far more effective than any single-seat fighter. On December 17, 1958, the Navy declared the Phantom the winner. What followed was an assault on the record books. Between 1959 and 1962, the F-4 set 16 world records, all but one in unmodified production aircraft. The Phantom was not merely fast. It was the fastest thing in the sky. On December 6, 1959, Commander Lawrence E. Flint, Jr. attempted something extraordinary. Flying the second YF-4H1 prototype from Naval Air Station Point Mugu, he executed Operation Top Flight, an attempt on the absolute altitude record. Flint accelerated to Mach 2.5 at 47,000 feet, then pulled the nose up into a 45-degree climb. The Phantom rocketed upward, both engines screaming at maximum thrust. As the aircraft climbed past 70,000 feet, the air grew too thin to sustain combustion safely. Flint deliberately shut down both J-79 engines to prevent overheating, but the Phantom kept climbing, coasting ballistically on pure momentum. Flint reached 98,557 feet, nearly 19 miles above the Earth, before the aircraft arced over and began its descent. He successfully restarted the engines in the dive through 70,000 feet, and recovered safely. The record stood as proof of what the Phantom could do. On May 24, 1961, Lieutenant Richard F. Gordon, Jr. tackled a different challenge. Operation LANA celebrated the 50th anniversary of naval aviation, with the letters standing for Anniversary of Naval Aviation preceded by the Roman numeral 50. Gordon planned to fly coast to coast faster than anyone in history. He departed Ontario International Airport near Los Angeles and headed east, with 3 aerial refueling tankers positioned along his route. Fighting headwinds and turbulence, Gordon pushed the Phantom to its limits. He touched down at Floyd Bennett Field in New York, 2 hours and 47 minutes after takeoff. His average speed was 869.74 miles per hour. Gordon won the prestigious Bendix Trophy for the achievement. He would later achieve even greater fame as the command module pilot on Gemini 11 and as an astronaut who walked on the moon during Apollo 12. Future moonwalker John W. Young also set time to climb records in the Phantom during Project High Jump. On one run, the aircraft Zoom climbed above 100,000 feet, briefly touching the edge of space. The Phantom was proving itself the dominant aircraft of its generation. The aircraft earned a menagerie of nicknames from the men who flew and maintained it. Pilots called it the Rhino for its hulking size and brute force approach to aerodynamics. Double Ugly acknowledged that the aircraft won no beauty contests from any angle. Lead Sled captured its heavy feel at low speeds. Old Smoky referenced the dense black smoke trail that poured from the J-79 engines at military power. German Luftwaffe crews who flew the export variant called it the Eisenschwein, the Iron Pig. But the most famous nickname of all captured the essential truth about the F-4 Phantom, proof that with enough thrust, even a brick can fly. The Marine Corps received its first Phantoms in June 1962, when VMFA 314, the Black Knights, stood up as the initial operational squadron at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California. Lieutenant Colonel Robert J. Barber personally delivered the first aircraft, Bureau No. 149452, on June 11. Two more arrived on June 29. The squadron immediately began the intensive training program necessary to bring a new aircraft type into operational service. The timing of the Phantom's arrival proved significant. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, and VMFA 531, the Grey Ghosts, deployed to Naval Air Station Key West to bolster air defenses around Florida. Their Phantoms stood alert, loaded with Sparrow missiles, ready to intercept any Cuban or Soviet aircraft that threatened American airspace. On at least one occasion, two Grey Ghost Phantoms nearly intercepted Cuban MiG-17s that had strayed close to American territory. The intercept was called off at the last moment, but the incident demonstrated how quickly the Phantom had become essential to American defense. The new fighter had arrived in Marine service just in time for a world on the brink of nuclear war. The F-4B was the initial production variant shared by the Navy and Marines. It was a formidable machine by any standard. Two General Electric J-79-GE-8 turbojets produced 16,950 pounds of thrust each in afterburner, giving the aircraft a combined 33,900 pounds of thrust to propel its 41,500-pound loaded weight. The Westinghouse AN/APQ-72 pulse radar could detect and track targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Four semi-recessed AIM-7 Sparrow missiles provided the primary armament for fleet defense missions, but the Phantom could also carry an astonishing load of air-to-ground ordnance. Depending on the mission, an F-4B could haul up to 16,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, and missiles on its 5 hard points. It was fast, reaching Mach 2.23 at altitude, over 1,470 miles per hour. It could climb to 62,000 feet. For the Marines, whose doctrine centered on the air-ground team, the Phantom's ability to carry enormous bomb loads while retaining air-to-air capability made it the ideal fighter attack platform. Unlike the Air Force, which used the Phantom primarily for air superiority and interdiction, the Marines would dedicate their Phantoms overwhelmingly to close air support. Every Marine rifleman on the ground understood that Marine aircraft existed to support him. The Phantom would prove the perfect expression of that philosophy. Over 3 decades, the Marines flew 4 fighter variants and 1 reconnaissance model, each representing an evolutionary leap in capability. The F-4J entered service in 1966 with the AN/APG-59 pulse Doppler radar, coupled with the AN/AWG-10 fire control system. This combination provided the first operational look-down, shoot-down capability in any fighter aircraft in the world. Previous radars could not distinguish low-flying aircraft from ground clutter. The F-4J could track and engage targets flying at treetop level while the Phantom cruised at high altitude. More powerful J-79-GE-10 engines delivered 17,844 pounds of afterburner thrust each. The aircraft also introduced 0-0 ejection seats, allowing crews to eject safely even while stationary on the ground, a critical safety improvement that would save many lives. The F-4N emerged from Project Beeline in the early 1970s. The Marines needed to extend the life of their aging F-4B fleet, but building new aircraft was prohibitively expensive. Project Beeline offered a solution. The program took 228 aging F-4Bs, completely stripped them down to their basic structure, replaced all wiring, added smokeless engines to eliminate the telltale black exhaust trail that made older Phantoms visible for miles, and installed new avionics, including the F-4J's slatted stabilizers. The result was a substantially improved aircraft at a fraction of new build cost. The F-4S represented the ultimate Marine Phantom. Converted from F-4J airframes, Beginning in the mid-1970s, approximately 265 aircraft received a comprehensive upgrade package. The most visible change was the addition of leading-edge maneuvering slats, small movable surfaces on the front of the wing that dramatically improved low-speed handling. These slats increased turning capability by 50%, transforming the Phantom from a straight-line speedster into a more agile dogfighter. Smokeless J-79-GE 10B engines produced 17,844 pounds of thrust while eliminating the smoke signature. New digital avionics improved reliability and reduced maintenance requirements. Most revolutionary was the Honeywell AN/AVG 8VTAS helmet-mounted sight, the world's first operational system allowing a pilot to designate targets simply by looking at them. The pilot wore a special helmet with sensors that tracked head position. When he looked at an enemy aircraft, the targeting system slaved the Sidewinder missile seeker to his line of sight. Instead of maneuvering the entire aircraft to point at a target, the pilot could simply look at it and fire. This technology was decades ahead of its time and would become standard on every subsequent generation of fighter aircraft. The F-4B was built exclusively for the Marine Corps. Just 46 airframes rolled off the production line between 1965 and December 24, 1970. The reconnaissance variant stretched the nose by nearly 5 feet to accommodate 3 camera stations capable of photographing terrain from low altitude at high speed. Side-looking airborne radar provided all-weather reconnaissance capability. Infrared sensors could detect heat sources on the ground even at night. The F-4B flew its missions alone and completely unarmed. Reconnaissance crews operated on a simple but terrifying principle. If they were detected and engaged, their only defense was speed and maneuverability. They could not shoot back. The aircraft carried no missiles, no bombs, no gun. The crews lived by the motto that defined their dangerous profession: alone, unarmed, and unafraid. The Vietnam War was the crucible that forged the Marine Phantom's reputation. On April 10, 1965, 15 F-4Bs of VMF A531, the Grey Ghosts, departed Naval Air Station Atsugi, Japan. On a mission that would mark a turning point in marine aviation history, the flight covered 2,500 miles over the Pacific, with KC-130 tanker aircraft providing aerial refueling along the route. When the Phantoms touched down at Da Nang Air Base in South Vietnam, they became the first Marine fixed-wing jet squadron in the combat zone since the Korean War. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces in Vietnam, had specifically requested a Phantom unit. He understood the F-4's unique capability to perform both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions with equal effectiveness. The Grey Ghosts earned the Presidential Unit Citation for their initial deployment, demonstrating the Phantom's versatility in the demanding conditions of Southeast Asia. They rotated home to the United States in July 1965 to train replacement crews, their mission accomplished. Over the next 8 years, 11 Marine squadrons flew Phantoms in Southeast Asia. They operated primarily from Da Nang and Chu Lai in South Vietnam, flying missions in support of Marine ground forces throughout the northern provinces. When the 1972 Easter Offensive threatened to overwhelm South Vietnamese defenses, Marine Phantom squadrons relocated to the austere Royal Thai Air Base at Nam Phong. The Marines grimly nicknamed that base the Rose Garden, after Lynn Anderson's hit country song and the Corps recruiting slogan, "We never promised you a rose garden." Navy Seabees had cleared little more than a runway in the middle of the Thai jungle. Designated Task Force Delta, the base offered primitive conditions that tested the endurance of Marines accustomed to at least minimal amenities. Pilots and ground crews lived in 10-man tents, set up in freshly cleared jungle. The tropical heat was oppressive. Insects were everywhere. Supply lines stretched thin. Yet the squadrons maintained an impressive operational tempo, flying combat missions over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos throughout the remainder of the war. VMF A542, the Bengals, dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs between May 1968 and January 1970. VMF A323, the Death Rattlers, flew more than 17,000 combat sorties across nearly continuous deployments from 1965 to 1969. VMF A115, the Silver Eagles, Flew over 34,000 combat sorties throughout the war, more than any other Marine Phantom squadron. They paid a terrible price for that distinction. 14 aircraft lost, 21 aircrew killed in action, 6 Marines killed by enemy rocket attacks on their airfields at Da Nang and Chu Lai. The Black Knights compiled a record that may never be matched. VMF A314 logged 49 consecutive months of combat operations, a feat of sustained combat deployment unprecedented in marine aviation. They accumulated over 25,000 combat hours and delivered more than £100 million of ordnance on enemy positions. The squadron won the Hanson Trophy for 1968 as the best Marine fighter attack squadron under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Frank E. Peterson, who would later become the first African-American general officer in Marine Corps history. Marine Phantoms carried everything the ordnance depots could provide. A fully loaded F-4 could haul up to 24 Mark 82, 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Napalm canisters spread burning gel across enemy positions. Snake-eye retarded bombs featured pop-out fins that slowed their fall, allowing pilots to drop ordnance at low altitude without being caught in their own explosions. Zuni 5-inch rockets provided precision strike capability against point targets. Cluster bomb units scattered hundreds of sub-munitions across wide areas. External 20mm gun pods partially compensated for the Phantom's lack of an internal cannon. VMF A122, the Crusaders, became known for a distinctive 3-gun pod configuration, their crews called the F-4V. 2 pods hung under the wings while a third mounted on the centerline station. The arrangement gave pilots enormous firepower for strafing runs, turning the Phantom into a flying gun platform. The Battle of Khe Sanh from January 21 to April 6, 1968, showcased Marine close air support at its most intense. 6,000 Marines held the isolated combat base against an estimated 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars who had surrounded the outpost. President Lyndon Johnson personally monitored the situation, fearing another Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 battle where the French had been decisively defeated by the Viet Minh. Operation Niagara unleashed devastating air power to break the siege. Over the 77-day battle, approximately 24,000 tactical sorties pounded North Vietnamese positions around the base. Marine Phantoms and Skyhawks flew constantly, alongside Air Force, Navy, and Vietnamese aircraft. B-52 strategic bombers added their enormous payloads to the deluge. VMFA 122 alone flew 629 sorties and dropped 1,300 tons of ordnance in a single month. Marine TPQ-10 radar operators positioned at the besieged base itself directed aircraft through monsoon weather that would have grounded operations in any previous war. The radar operators could pinpoint enemy positions and guide bomb runs with devastating precision. Over the siege's duration, approximately 100,000 tons of bombs fell around the base, an average of more than 1,300 tons per day. The North Vietnamese eventually withdrew, unable to sustain their assault under such devastating aerial bombardment. The close air support-focused mission meant Marine Phantom crews rarely encountered enemy fighters. While Air Force and Navy Phantoms regularly tangled with North Vietnamese MiGs over Hanoi and Haiphong, Marine aircraft concentrated on supporting Marines on the ground. The result was a modest air-to-air record of just 3 confirmed MiG kills, but each one tells a remarkable story. The first Marine MiG kill came on December 17, 1967. Captain Doyle D. Baker was not flying a Marine Phantom that day. He was on exchange duty with the Air Force's 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron, serving as the weapons systems officer in the back seat of an F-4D out of Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base. The pilot was First Lieutenant John D. Ryan. During an Operation Rolling Thunder strike near Hanoi, their flight encountered North Vietnamese MiG-17s, attempting to intercept the American bombers. Baker acquired the target on radar and fired an AIM-4 Falcon missile. The missile tracked true and the MiG disintegrated. Baker had previously flown F-4Bs with VMF A513 in Vietnam, making him a Marine aviator credited with an Air Force kill from the back seat. The second Marine MiG kill fell on August 12, 1972. Captain Lawrence G. Richard was also on Air Force exchange duty, assigned to the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron flying F-4Es out of Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base during Operation Linebacker. When MiG-21s rose to challenge an American strike package, Richard engaged. His AIM-7E2 Sparrow found its mark and destroyed a MiG-21. His backseater was Navy Lieutenant Commander Michael J. Ettel, making the crew a Marine pilot, Navy officer, and Air Force aircraft. It may have been the most inter-service MiG kill of the entire war. The third, and the only all-Marine MiG kill, was the most dramatic of all. On September 11, 1972, Major Lee T. Bear Lassiter and Captain John D. Lil John Cummings of VMF A333, the Fighting Shamrocks, launched from the deck of USS America as part of Carrier Air Wing 8. VMF A333 was the only Marine Phantom squadron to deploy aboard a Navy aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War. The squadron had embarked in June and was flying combat missions as part of the Air Wing's daily operations. Ground controllers vectored the Shamrock Phantoms toward Phuc Yen Airfield, north of Haiphong, where North Vietnamese MiG-21s were circling, apparently preparing to intercept an American strike. Lassiter closed on the enemy formation and began firing. His first Sparrow missed. His second Sparrow missed. His third and fourth Sparrows also failed to guide. He switched to Sidewinders. The first Sidewinder failed. The second Sidewinder failed. 6 missiles fired, 6 missiles wasted. Lassiter was down to his last weapon. His 7th missile, an AIM-9D Sidewinder, finally tracked true. It struck a silver MiG-21 squarely and blew the aircraft apart in a ball of fire. Before Lassiter could celebrate, he spotted another MiG-21 maneuvering behind his wingman, Captain Scotty Dudley. Lassiter fired his 8th and final missile, damaging the second MiG and forcing it to break off its attack. Then everything went wrong. An SA-2 surface-to-air missile, a telephone pole-sized weapon fired from the ground, struck Lassiter's tail section. The Phantom shuddered violently as shrapnel tore through the aircraft. Pulling up to -6 Gs over the most heavily defended airspace in North Vietnam, Lassiter fought to control his crippled jet. He and Cummings egressed toward the coast, flying on adrenaline and determination. Over the Gulf of Tonkin, with the aircraft no longer controllable, both men ejected. Dudley's aircraft had also been hit, riddled by anti-aircraft artillery fire and hemorrhaging fuel. He and his backseater ejected as well. All 4 Marines splashed into the Gulf and were quickly recovered by Navy rescue helicopters. They returned to America to a hero's welcome. Lassiter received the Silver Star for his actions and was named Marine Corps Aviator of the Year for 1972. Against these victories stood a heavy toll. Marine Phantoms suffered approximately 75 combat losses in Vietnam, the vast majority to anti-aircraft artillery and ground fire, rather than enemy aircraft. Only one confirmed loss came from an air-to-air engagement. On August 26, 1972, First Lieutenant Sam Cordova and Darrell Borders of VMFA 232 were shot down by a MiG-21 flown by Vietnamese People's Air Force ace Nguyen Duc Sot near the Laos and North Vietnam border. Borders ejected successfully and was rescued by friendly forces. Cordova ejected but died while missing in action. His remains were not recovered until December 1988. He was the only Marine F-4 crewman lost as a direct result of air-to-air combat. The last Marine squadron to leave Southeast Asia was VMFA 232, the Red Devils, who departed Nam Phong, Thailand, in September 1973. Their Phantoms were the final Marine aircraft in the theatre, bringing to a close 8 years of continuous Marine Phantom operations in the war. The end of Vietnam did not end the Phantom's relevance. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Marine Phantom squadrons formed a critical component of the Corps' expeditionary posture across the globe. Active duty units operated from Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort in South Carolina, Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, and Marine Corps Air Station Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii. Forward deployed squadrons rotated through MCAS Iwakuni in Japan, Clark Air Base in the Philippines, Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, and bases in South Korea as part of the unit deployment program. Marine Phantoms deployed repeatedly to NATO's northern and southern flanks, demonstrating the Corps' ability to reinforce European defences on short notice. VMF A251, the Thunderbolts, carried the flag across Europe throughout this period. They deployed to Sigili Air Base in Turkey in 1973, Rota Naval Station in Spain in 1975, and Trondheim, Norway in 1980. During Exercise Northern Wedding 82 off the coast of Denmark, 102 Soviet aircraft flew provocative sorties against NATO naval forces, testing alliance defences and gathering intelligence. The Marine Phantoms were there to meet them. In April 1982, VMF A251 deployed to Naval Air Station Keflavik, Iceland, on the northern edge of the NATO alliance. Iceland occupied a critical position in Atlantic defence, sitting astride the routes Soviet submarines and bombers would have to cross to reach American and European targets. Marine Phantoms stood hot pad alert, crews sitting in their cockpits ready to launch on minutes' notice. The alert paid off when radar detected 6 Soviet Tu-95 Bear bombers approaching Icelandic airspace. The massive turboprop bombers, each capable of carrying nuclear cruise missiles, represented a direct threat to the Atlantic sea lanes. Marine Phantoms scrambled, climbed to intercept altitude, and rendezvoused with the Soviet formation. Flying in close formation with the Bears, Marine crews photographed the aircraft and their crews, visual confirmation of Soviet probing operations. The intercept was routine by Cold War standards, but it demonstrated that the Phantom remained a frontline weapon 15 years after Vietnam. Perhaps the most dramatic post-Vietnam deployment came during the Iran hostage crisis. On November 4, 1979, Iranian revolutionary students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. The crisis would drag on for 444 days, dominating the final year of President Jimmy Carter's administration. When diplomatic efforts failed to secure the hostages' release, Carter authorized a military rescue attempt. Operation Eagle Claw launched on April 24, 1980. The plan called for Army Delta Force operators to fly into Iran aboard Navy helicopters, land at a remote site called Desert One, transfer to trucks driven by CIA agents, drive to Tehran, storm the embassy, rescue the hostages, and fly out aboard Marine helicopters to a captured airfield. It was an enormously complex operation, with dozens of potential failure points. Marine F-4Ns, from VMF, a 323, the Death Rattlers, and VMF, a 531, the Grey Ghosts, stood ready aboard USS Coral Sea to provide air cover for the operation. Because Iran operated American-built F-4s and F-14s purchased before the revolution, the Marine Phantoms bore special invasion stripes on their right wings to prevent fratricide. Red and black stripes identified VMFA 323 aircraft. Yellow and black stripes marked VMFA 531. Their orders were unambiguous. Shoot down any Iranian combat aircraft that threatened the rescue force. The mission never reached that point. Mechanical failures disabled multiple helicopters at Desert One, and the mission was aborted. During the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a C-130 transport aircraft, killing 8 American servicemen. The Desert One disaster ended the rescue attempt and contributed to Carter's defeat in the 1980 presidential election. But the Marine Phantom's mission was not finished. When the abort order came, VMFA 323 continued flying round-the-clock combat air patrol over the Persian Gulf until every American support ship had safely cleared the area. The squadron's performance earned the Presidential Unit Citation. The deployment marked the first time in history that an entire carrier battle group's air superiority mission was provided exclusively by Marine fighters. The central question of the Marine Phantom story is why the Corps held onto the aircraft 5 to 6 years longer than the Navy and roughly concurrent with the Air Force's retirement of their standard Phantom variants. The answer lies at the intersection of bureaucratic reality, budget politics, and procurement arithmetic. The Marines operated under the Department of the Navy budget, competing directly with the Navy for what insiders called blue dollars. A Pentagon source quoted in the U.S. Naval Institute's proceedings in 1989 stated the dynamic bluntly: the Marines are well down the list of Navy aviation priorities. The Navy's own Phantom replacement was the expensive F-14 Tomcat, a swept-wing interceptor that consumed enormous resources and was never offered to the Marines. The Tomcat's unit cost and operating expenses far exceeded what the Marine Corps could afford within its allocated budget. Instead, the Corps waited for the more affordable F-18 Hornet, a new design that promised to combine fighter and attack capabilities in a single airframe. But the Hornet had to be shared from the same production line the Navy was also drawing from. Every F-18 that went to a Marine squadron was one fewer for the Navy, and the Navy had priority. Compounding the problem, the Marines were simultaneously procuring two major aircraft programs during the 1980s. They needed the F-18 Hornet to replace the Phantom and the AV-8B Harrier II to replace their aging AV-8A Harriers and A-4 Skyhawks. The AV-8B program nearly died multiple times. The Department of Defense attempted to cancel it in 1978, 1979, and 1980, pressuring the Marines to adopt the F-18 exclusively and abandon the Harrier concept. The Marines refused. The vertical takeoff capability of the Harrier was essential to Corps doctrine, allowing operations from amphibious assault ships and austere forward bases where conventional aircraft could not operate. Congress ultimately funded the Harrier at $1.6 billion for 24 aircraft annually from 1989 to 1991. But every dollar committed to Harrier procurement was a dollar unavailable for accelerating Hornet deliveries. The sheer number of squadrons requiring conversion stretched the transition across a full decade. The Marines needed to equip approximately 12 to 15 active and reserve fighter attack squadrons, plus the VMFAT-101 training unit at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro. That required well over 150 aircraft. With limited annual production rates shared between the Navy and Marine Corps, deliveries to Marine squadrons were sequenced slowly. Active duty squadrons converted first. Reserve units waited at the back of the line. VMF A314, the Black Knights, received the Marine Corps' first F-18, as on January 7, 1983. It was fitting bookend symmetry, as they had also been the first Marine Phantom squadron 20 years earlier. By the mid-1980s, the West Coast active duty squadrons had largely transitioned to the Hornet. East Coast squadrons at MCAS Beaufort followed, with VMFA 333, the Fighting Shamrocks, becoming the last active-duty Phantom squadron when it transitioned to Hornets in October 1987. But the Hawaii-based squadrons of Marine Aircraft Group 24 and the reserve squadrons of the 4th Marine Aircraft Wing still flew Phantoms well into the late 1980s. VMFA 212 began its Hornet transition in October 1988. VMFA 134 followed in mid-1989. The reserve squadrons waited longest of all. The F-4S variant that sustained these final squadrons was no museum piece. Its leading-edge slats delivered a 50% improvement in turning capability over the original F-4J. The smokeless engines eliminated the old J-79's telltale black smoke trail that had once announced the Phantom's presence from miles away. The helmet-mounted sight remained genuinely ahead of its time. Against the Soviet threats of the 1980s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, and Su-27s, the F-4S was increasingly outclassed in pure air-to-air performance. But for the Marine Corps' primary missions of close air support and battlefield interdiction, it remained effective. The Phantom could still carry over 18,000 pounds of ordnance on 9 hardpoints. It still pushed past Mach 2 in a dive, and it still brought its crews home. But age was winning. By the late 1980s, F-4S airframes were 15 to 20 years old. Metal fatigues. Systems wear out. Spare parts become scarce as manufacturers shift production to newer aircraft. One museum donated F-4S. Bureau number 157307 had accumulated 5,075 flight hours, 6,804 landings, including 1,337 arrested carrier landings, and 1,163 catapult shots by the time it retired in November 1988. Such numbers would have been inconceivable when the aircraft was designed. Maintenance hours per flight hour climbed steadily as crews struggled to keep aging systems operational. The FA-18, by contrast, offered vastly superior reliability, modern digital avionics, and single-pilot multi-role capability that made the Phantom's retirement not just inevitable but overdue. The final chapter of Marine Phantom history was written by reserve squadrons. VMFP-3, Eyes of the Corps, was deactivated on July 1, 1990, retiring the last RF-4Bs and ending tactical photo reconnaissance as a dedicated Marine mission. The role was absorbed by FA-18D two-seat Hornets, carrying the Advanced Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance System pod. VMF P3's disbanding marked the end of active-duty Marine Phantom operations. VMF A321, Hells Angels, at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland. The first Marine Reserve Squadron to receive the Phantom back in December 1973, stood down its F-4S aircraft in 1991 and began an accelerated transition to the Hornet that left VMFA 112, the Cowboys, at Naval Air Station Dallas, Texas, as the last Marine Squadron and the last naval aviation unit of any kind still flying the Phantom. The Cowboys had received F-4N Phantoms in 1976 and upgraded to the F-4S in 1987. On January 18, 1992, they retired their final aircraft. Phantom veterans from across the Corps gathered at NAS Dallas to pay tribute to an aircraft that had served the Marines for nearly 30 years. The celebration became a reunion of decades, with pilots and radar intercept officers who had flown the Phantom in Vietnam standing alongside the reservists who had carried the torch into the 1990s. They shared stories, traded memories, and said goodbye to an aircraft that had defined their careers. The gap between the last Phantom flight and the first Hornet sortie was bridged on October 8, 1992, when Captain Joe Crip Riley flew VMFA-112's first FA-18A, completing a transition that had taken the entire Marine Corps a full decade. The retired Phantoms scattered to various fates. Most went to the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, the famous boneyard, where rows of Phantoms baked in the desert sun alongside thousands of other retired military aircraft. Many were eventually converted into QF-4 unmanned target drones, serving one final purpose as full-scale aerial targets for weapons testing. The QF-4 program continued for decades, allowing the Phantom to keep flying long after it left operational service. On December 21, 2016, 4 pilots flying 4 single-seat QF-4s conducted what was called the final flight at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel Ron King led the formation alongside retired Lieutenant Colonel Jim Wham Harkins and 2 other veteran Phantom pilots. It was the very last manned flight of any F-4 Phantom in American service, more than 58 years after Robert Little's maiden flight in St. Louis. The brick had finally stopped flying. The men who flew the Marine Phantom remembered it in terms that mixed reverence with candor. Commander Peter Mirsky, writing the definitive Phantom farewell tribute in Naval History magazine, called the F-4 this generation's Spitfire. He captured its sensory impact in vivid terms. If you ever stood on the ramp and listened to a section of Phantoms take off in full burner, the earth shook all around you. Mirsky described recoveries where the Phantoms squealed their way around the pattern, like listening to New York City's entire fleet of subway cars breaking their metal wheels. He mourned what future aviators would never experience, writing that theirs is a loss for never having flown the F-4. Marine pilots praised the Phantom's incredible speed and acceleration, its good radar, and its performance in the vertical, while acknowledging its limitations in sustained turning fights. The lack of an internal gun remained a sore point throughout its naval service. General John R. Daly, who flew RF-4Bs with VMCJ-1 in Vietnam and later rose to 4-star rank as Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, remarked that everyone in RF-4s wished they had a gun. Major John Trotty of VMFA 314 channeled his combat experience into Phantom over Vietnam, one of the most widely read memoirs of marine aviation in Southeast Asia. The transition to the FA-18 Hornet brought undeniable gains. The Hornet was a true single-pilot, multi-role fighter with digital avionics, an internal M61A1 Vulcan cannon, dramatically better agility, lower maintenance requirements, and higher sortie rates. Operating costs dropped significantly. Reliability improved enormously, a factor that mattered to budget-constrained Marine squadrons more than almost anything else. but the Phantom gave up things the Hornet could never match. The F-4's Mach 2.23 top speed exceeded the Hornet's Mach 1.8 by nearly 300 miles per hour. The raw thrust of two massive J-79 engines created acceleration that pilots described in visceral terms. The two-crew synergy between pilot and radar intercept officer, the partnership of flying and fighting, was lost in the single-seat FA, 18A, and C variants. The dedicated RF-4B photo reconnaissance platform, replaced by pods bolted onto FA-18Ds, sacrificed specialization for flexibility. The significance of the Marine Phantom transcends statistics. The F-4 was the aircraft that carried the Corps through the most intense period of sustained combat operations since World War II. It provided the backbone of expeditionary air power during the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. It proved that determined maintenance and thoughtful upgrades could keep a 1950s design relevant into the 1990s. Approximately 25 squadrons operated the F-4 across its variants, including active-duty fighter attack units, reserve squadrons, training units, and reconnaissance squadrons. 11 deployed to Southeast Asia. 3 Marine crews scored confirmed MiG kills. Roughly 75 Phantoms were lost in combat, the vast majority to ground fire. On that January day in 1992, as the last J-79 engines spooled down for the final time at NAS Dallas, 3 decades of thunder fell silent. The Phantom had outlived its designer's expectations, outperformed the doctrine that created it, and outlasted every prediction of its obsolescence. For the United States Marine Corps, no aircraft before or since has served longer, fought harder, or been mourned more deeply. The brick had finally stopped flying. But the legacy it built will endure as long as Marines take to the sky.